Order. We're going to hear from Kevin Haig.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to perhaps start off where the previous speaker left off on the issue of balancing rights or balancing harms, because, Mr. Speaker, all law is in some way a restriction of personal liberty. That's the point of law. And when we pass a law, we have to be confident that that restriction of liberty is justified by the protection of the person whose liberty is thus constrained from harm or detriment to some other person or people. In this House, what we need to consider is that balance between the protection from harm and the restriction of liberty. And so I want to pass that test over the various provisions of this bill at this point. I want to come first of all to this issue of UV tanning. It seems to me that, and Paul Hutchison may well be watching this debate, and if he is, I extend my best wishes to him. We could actually frame this as the Paul Hutchison clause in this bill. I was going to say memorial, but that would be wrong. Mr. Speaker, the provision in this bill is at the most timid level imaginable. And I was intrigued to hear Jonathan Coleman and his contribution to this debate saying that the age limit of 18 was struck because there was evidence of disproportionate harm to persons under the age of 18. Well, I'll be very interested indeed to see that evidence at the Select Committee. I was intrigued that there wasn't, as we usually have actually in the case of age limits on behaviours, a case made based on maturity or otherwise to make a decision about the harm that's being incurred with an activity. That wasn't the government's case. It was instead a case based on disproportionate harm. So I'm going to be very interested to see that. I would argue, Mr. Speaker, that the evidence actually is that there is significant risk of harm at every age. You know, that is the evidence that I've seen, and that would be consistent with also the point that Jonathan Coleman made about the fact that the voluntary code of practice that his predecessor put in place has not worked. That the industry has not complied with the voluntary code of practice, and well, Mr. Speaker, what a surprise. That's usually what we experience with these voluntary codes of practice. And the fact is that people who use these UV tanning beds or salons incur significant risk of skin cancers. And they do so in a situation where the information that is available to them is insufficient for them to form a reasonable view and themselves to make an informed decision about the level of risk that they are incurring. Mr. Speaker, that's a case for not allowing these to exist at all. And I'll be very interested to hear the evidence at Select Committee. That's particularly important, Mr. Speaker, because at least 3 states in Australia have now banned these things altogether from the end of this year. And what that means is that a substantial problem that we currently have, which is that some of the equipment that's available in these tanning salons is already second-hand and of substandard quality, that problem is going to get worse because there's going to be now a glut of second-hand machines from those states in Australia that are banning this altogether. And we will get the cast-offs from those Australian states, posing greater risk, a greater risk that the New Zealand public and the customers of these salons will be unaware of and uninformed of. I want to come now to the communicable disease provisions of the bill, obvious companions to UV tanning facilities in this bill. And these are around contact tracing, notifiability of disease and restriction of liberty. And members may be aware that these are provisions that I have considerable familiarity with in relation to my previous work with the New Zealand AIDS Foundation. again, there are various balances to be struck. When contact tracing becomes compulsory, as it does under this bill, then there certainly is a restriction on the liberty and on the rights of the person who is being required to, for example, reveal who their sexual contacts have been. There are also potentially, Mr. Speaker, some problems with revealing who those sexual contacts have been. One that's familiar to contact tracers in the public health field. But there's, in relation to the balance that this House must strike, there is an issue also with whether, in fact, we enhance or inhibit our ability to actually contact trace by making mandatory. And a previous speaker has already alluded to that if someone knows that they may be required to reveal who their sexual contacts have been, they may not present for treatment. They may not present to health services. That has been our experience, Mr. Speaker. So striking the balance correctly is going to be very important. Notifiability also. Having a disease notifiable, clearly that can be useful. But again, if a person knows that this bill provides, as it does, for the medical officer of health to be able to require a testing laboratory to reveal the identity of the person who has just tested positive for HIV or for syphilis or for gonorrhea, well, Mr. Speaker, what may happen in that situation is that the person may not present. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be interested to hear the evidence, that it may be better to provide, as we do for AIDS, which is a notifiable disease, for anonymous testing. So the Select Committee needs to consider that. And then, Mr. Speaker, the balance around restriction of liberty and the public good that is gained is particularly apparent in the new powers of medical officers of health to compel various levels of behaviour. As I say, I was at the AIDS Foundation and had to use all of these provisions from the existing 1956 Act, an act that came into place largely reflecting the experience of New Zealand in managing tuberculosis. And so we were needing to deal with modern diseases and modern circumstances such as the HIV epidemic, with powers that were created for a different bygone era and a totally different kind of disease. And Mr. Speaker, we found them all to be inadequate for the purpose. That's why we were strong supporters back in 2001 when I had to deal with the Christopher Truscott case that some members of this House may recall, using these archaic powers of reform of the Health Act. And the AIDS Foundation had been strong supporters of the Public Health Bill, and I'm grateful to Annette King for outlining some of the history of that bill. Annette King didn't mention that the bill introduced in 2007 was merely the latest attempt to have a public health bill, and that previous attempts had also foundered. As she says, this bill, which was reported back from the Select Committee, and members of the public have had a chance already to express a view about many of the provisions of this bill in relation to that public health bill. That bill reported back to this House in 2008 has languished near the bottom of the order paper since that time. Mr. Speaker, it would have been much better simply to advance the public health bill further up the order paper. We would have had cutting-edge legislation able to deal with these issues much more quickly than we will have dealing with this bill had we done that. Why haven't we done so, Mr. Speaker? We haven't done so for the reasons that National outlined in its minority report on the Select Committee's report back of the public health bill. Essentially, they opposed the provisions of that bill to deal with non-communicable diseases, and they opposed them because of their proximity to the very industries that drive the epidemics of non-communicable disease in New Zealand. Mr. Speaker, the conflicts of interest that are apparent in National's opposition to the public health bill are the very conflicts of interest that are now coming back to bite it over its management of the Catherine Rich Health Promotion Agency issue. They have to figure out where they stand.